Focus too closely on the small things, you'll miss the whole image altogether. You're an absolute gem. Thank you for clicking on my Suspect series. I'm Brooke McKenna, and this is another one of my 16 days of Halloween where I'm posting every other day in October. But this story is absolutely insane. Today, it will completely blow your mind and creep you out all at the same time. Over a decade of crimes were finally solved, but it was more like completely unraveled. You will never guess what they found. By the way, most of this was in Germany and in German in the articles, and so I had very little information to go on. I did try my best in this video though, but if you do know German or you found more articles and have more information, I'd love to hear it down in the comments below. And that also means that a lot of the names and the places I will probably mispronounce, so I'm so sorry. I do not mean to offend anybody, but it is a very interesting story nonetheless. So if you're excited about 16 days of Halloween, please make sure to thumbs up and subscribe. Now let's get back to the story. So it all started in Adar, Oberstein, Germany in 1993. This was a place that was basically known as the leading gemstone cutting place in Europe, and also was a place that tourists came to look at the Church of Rock that was on the hills. But it was a pretty quiet, usual town. On May 23rd, a neighbor went to check on her friend who she hadn't heard from in a while, and she went and knocked on her door. She tried to phone her, and neither were successful in getting her attention, so she decided to go ahead and call the police. The police got there and found 62-year-old Lieselette Slinger. She was strangled by a wire that had come from a flower bouquet in her home. Dozens of possible witnesses were questioned, but nobody really knew anything. The only thing the police really knew was that it was probably robbery because her bank account was drained right afterwards. But other than that, all they had was DNA evidence found on a brightly painted teacup rim that was in the room. They had put it in the DNA database to try to find a match, but found 0 matches to this DNA. And so basically back in 1983, they just had to wait for the criminal to mess up again and commit another crime. It took 8 whole years for another victim to be found. It was March 21st of 2001, and it was 3 hours and 19 minutes away from the first killing in Freiburg. A man was strangled to death in his home, and DNA evidence was found on a kitchen drawer that seemed to be the same as the previous DNA. But again, 0 matches were found in the database. Just a few months later, in October of 2001, in Gerolstein, which was about 5 hours away from the second murder, the DNA was found again, but it wasn't on a victim this time. It was actually on a heroin syringe that a little boy brought in after stepping on it on the playground. This DNA was found to match the other 2 DNAs, but still nobody in the system. 2 weeks later, on October 24th, a caravan was burglarized, and when investigators went to search the scene, they found DNA on an unfinished cookie in the van. This DNA matched the other ones. Again, for the second time in a row, there was no victim and no murder. It was a little over a year later when the DNA evidence was found again on New Year's Day in 2003 at an office that had just been broken into in Detzenbach. At the end of that year in Heilbronn, a car had been stolen and was later found abandoned with this DNA on the gas cap. After all of this, the police knew that the suspect in question was a woman of European or Russian descent. She was probably a drug addict. She was a theft and liked to kill old people, and was most likely cold-hearted, which is pretty obvious. But the police still didn't have any leads or any suspects to go on. And the crimes continued in 2004 in Arbos, France, when Vietnamese gemstone traders were robbed and the DNA was found on a toy pistol. The next year, in May 6, 2005, in Worms, Germany, the DNA was found again. There had been a fight between 2 brothers, where a brother pointed his 7.65 caliber gun at his brother and attempted to use it on him. The man was arrested, witnesses were called in, and that is when the DNA was found on one of the bullets in the gun. And throughout this investigation, DNA of other men were being found at the scenes, but never the same one over again. 3 men were brought in during the investigation. They were questioned, but none of them would say anything about this female that seemed to be as though she was in charge of this entire thing, or she was possibly their partner. They weren't talking if that was true. A year later, on October 3rd of 2006, another break-in began at a company in Saarbrücken, Germany, and they had actually witnessed a man throw a rock through the glass to try to break in. They called the police, they told them this, and then when they went to collect evidence, they picked up the rock that was used to smash in the window and found DNA evidence of this woman, even though witnesses knew that they had seen a man. In March of 2007, another burglary happened in an optometrist shop in Austria, and her DNA was found yet again. In fact, nearly 20 burglaries happened between 2003 and 2007, and DNA was showing up for her at all of them, but she was never being caught in security footage or by any eyewitnesses, and she was then referred to as the woman without a face because she literally seemed to not exist. Did you really think that was all? Oh no. There's much more, many more deaths to come in this case. And on April 25th of 2007, a 22-year-old police officer, Michelle Kaiswader, was actually shot to death in her police car in Heilbronn. Her partner, Martin Arnold, was also there at the time of the shooting, and he was put into a coma right away. He was still breathing, he survived, but he was shot as well, and they were both shot in the back of the head. 2 different guns were found to have shot them, and both of their guns from being police officers were gone, as well as their handcuffs. Witnesses saw a strong male in a white shirt running away from the scene. Police believed that it was possibly a gang that had done this to her, that Michelle had been working on trying to bust. DNA was tested, and it was found that this same woman without a face was found inside of this car, the same BMW patrol car that Michelle was shot to death in. In Michelle's case, they had a drug dealer in question who then was found to have a very strong alibi, and after they found the bit of saliva with this female DNA on it, they knew it had to be this phantom. And that's when they thought, okay, maybe since people saw the man fleeing the scene, they've seen a man at burglaries, maybe she had an accomplice. Maybe it was a man and woman working together. Then they realized that in Heilbronn, the same place where she worked, there was a task force that was set up in the parking lot of their police station that was looking for this woman without a face. And that is when she got her name, the Phantom of Heilbronn. Then in January of 2008, 3 bodies were killed in Heilbronn, Germany, and the car used to transfer their bodies had her DNA in it. These bodies were then found in the river, and a suspect named Talib was questioned about it and asked if he had a female accomplice, and he said no. He said he had been trafficking cars with these people, and there was never a woman in his car. 6 more burglaries after that found her DNA at a swimming pool, at lots of different houses, and an apartment complex all over the place. On May 9th, a cleaning lady was struck in the back of the head, and $300 was stolen from the clubhouse where she worked. The Phantom of Heilbronn was again found at the scene, but not actually on her body, in the room where she had stolen the money. In October of 2008, an auxiliary nurse was found dead in her car, and the same DNA was found at the scene. Police teams from all over were working together. They were having meetings, they were emailing, because there was such a wide area of where the crimes were happening that they all had to work together on it to try to figure it out. The killer's MO was also all over the place too. They went from killing to then just burglarizing to back to killing to theft to, it was all over the place. By 2008, they had nearly $300,000 for her reward money for any information to find her. Saliva swabs were being taken on women from Germany to France to Belgium to Italy, and they were looking at like homeless people. They were looking at people who were on drugs, who possibly had records, anybody possible that could fit this serial killer's profile. They knew that because of the break-ins and the stealing that this woman was probably low on money. They knew because of the needle she was probably a drug addict, and because of the locations of the crimes they could pinpoint an area where she could possibly live. But she was still not being found with that profile, and a lot of people started to think that possibly another criminal was using someone else's DNA to place at the crime scenes that was dead. So they were using a dead person's DNA to get away with their crimes. was. But 15 years of ongoing crimes and murders were stacking up, and the public wanted answers. Then something surprised everyone. A composite sketch of this possible Phantom of Heilbronn came out, but it looked like a man. Witnesses at a 2006 apartment burglary in Saarbrücken told them of the man that they had seen. It looked exactly like a man, and they described him in grave detail. And so this picture of this Phantom of Heilbronn that used to be known as a woman without a face and had female DNA now looked like a man. It was then believed that there was a possibility that this phantom was transsexual and liked to wear or looked like the opposite sex. But even with this man's sketch, no man, woman ever came forward or ever was brought forward to the police, and so they were still at square one basically. The public was calling the Phantom the most mysterious serial killer of all time. Police were certain that this wasn't some genius, that basically this person had worn gloves so they didn't leave any fingerprints, and they would strike and then get out, and that was how they were getting away with it, that it wasn't some master plan, that it was just as simple as that. And although I know that with saying that they were trying to say that the Phantom wasn't someone to idolize, it kind of made the police look bad, because if this person was so simple-minded as they were trying to say, why weren't they catching them? And although they were begging for a DNA match in this crime, or these crimes, they knew that that would not automatically close the case, because they still had to figure out how it got there and why and what role it played in the crimes. Because it didn't necessarily mean that that DNA connected to the person who did the crime. In January of 2009, a special task force was finally put together very seriously to find the serial killer and serial burglar. And what they found after 3 months was one of the strangest things to have ever happened. There was a man who had been seeking protection in France in 2002 who had been burned in a fire. He'd been burned alive, and while they were trying to put together the profile of him to try to find who he was, they found that the male, who they believed very wholeheartedly was a he, had DNA evidence of a female. But they knew for sure that this body was a male, not a female. So they did another test using a different swab, different evidence, and it came back as a male like they expected. And that is when embarrassment filled the room, the police departments, and everybody just felt incredibly stupid and a little relieved at the same time. Because this serial killer's DNA had never been found at any of the crime scenes that they thought it had. Because the DNA evidence was already on the cotton swab used to test for the DNA evidence. That's right. The Phantom of Heilbronn never existed. An investigation began, and even though the German authorities didn't want it to happen, the government actually took over and investigated anyways, and they found that the cotton swabs that were being made at the Greiner Bio 1 were contaminated by workers there. They were of European descent, working in Austria, like the profile had thought, and they had been the ones contaminating these swabs. One especially. Now, this woman didn't do it on purpose, though. Cotton swabs were sterile, which meant that they could get rid of bacteria, fungus, anything like that, but they couldn't get rid of DNA. Stuff like sweat, cells, skin particles, saliva, all of those things stayed on the cotton swabs. And when you're working in a factory, it'd be pretty hard not to get a little bit of sweat on the product you were using. These factories weren't wrong either, because they had never said it was okay to use for DNA evidence, but the police stations believed that it was, because it was double packaged and looked like the Mercedes of cotton swabs. Those exact swabs were being sent out to many different countries around there, which made it seem like the serial killer was traveling. One place those swabs were not sent: Bavaria. And that has 0 crimes reported with the Phantom of Heilbronn's DNA. Coincidence? I think not. At least 6 murders and 40 burglaries, all thought to be done by one woman who continued to get away. Except she never really existed. It makes you wonder how many criminals got away with their crimes because police were focused on the Phantom. Unfortunately, I couldn't get much info on most of the victims in these cases and if their cases were ever solved or re-looked into, but I do know that the 22-year-old police officer Michelle, her case has been closed. Back in 2011, a woman actually came forward saying that she was in a terrorist group. She was coming forward because 2 of the other members had committed suicide after a failed robbery attempt, and she basically felt alone, or felt like she didn't know what else to do, so she turned herself in. They went to raid their homes of the men who committed suicide and her, and found the pistols of the police officers that had been stolen, and found some of Michelle's DNA at their houses. So at least in Michelle's case, she did get a case that was finally closed. Police, I'm sure, still have a handful of cases that are unsolved because they were chasing a woman who didn't exist for 16 years. And I can't even imagine the amount of money they spent trying to chase her as well. But let's just hope DNA evidence gets better in the future so this never happens again. Police were overly mortified about this and having to tell the public that they were mistaken for so long. They put in like close to 16,000 hours of overtime just to chase someone that was on a cotton swab in a factory. How in the world would they have known that? That is something that no case you ever think about. I mean, back then I'm sure that was the last thing on their mind, to check the equipment for the crime scenes. But I'm sure that they do a lot now. And what Germany didn't know is that Austrian authorities had actually decommissioned all cotton swabs from that certain factory in early 2009 because something exactly like that had happened with another mysterious DNA donor. They completely admit their mistake now. They do routine checks on the cotton swabs to make sure nobody's DNA is still on there. And they also have used this as a warning to never base an investigation solely on DNA evidence. So were you expecting that outcome? If not, I'd love to hear your crazy theories down below, what you think. I actually read a theory that possibly the woman in the factory was actually the serial killer and serial burglar, and she worked at the factory to cover it up in the future. I think that'd be a lot of work and a lot of time that you'd have to have worried about, how they were going to catch you, and it would have been very hard to do. But that's a cool theory if you think about it, that it could have possibly been that lady. But I'm sure that they did, investigate her. I'm sure. I hope. But anyways, I hope you guys liked this story. It was very creepy, it was very different, and please make sure to thumbs up if you want more of these videos. Remember, I will be back with another video in 2 days, and don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye. Everyone makes mistakes, but will you learn from them from day to day?